We're back today. We are talking rebuilds and what we should focus on right now in rebuilds. A lot of this is going to be strategic. We're going to drop some examples to, make a case for what we're doing right now with our rebuilding teams to help the rebuilding teams that are out there. When I'm looking at rebuilds right now, the first thing I'm looking at, and a lot of the times I'm looking at continuously throughout my rebuilds, is identifying liquid assets that no longer fit my rebuild, but do have value to competitive teams in the league. So basically, what pieces do and don't fit where I'm going as a team. Obviously, I know I'm rebuilding, but it's a matter of how much longer am I going to be rebuilding? What bets do I have that I can move now or need to be incentivized to move before the end of the season or even early in the regular season to, not have points on my roster? A point we'll discuss a little bit later, but I am always so cognizant of when I have a rebuilding team. I don't want to lose out on value. And I feel like if I'm holding out of these aging vets too long, I don't want to be left holding onto that value bag, thinking that aging vets are going to outlast my rebuild in the long term. Now, this doesn't just apply to those aging vets, guys with what I believe to be short shelf lives of value, like an Alexander Madison, for an example. I do think he's just a player whose value and production I don't expect to outlast my rebuild. I think by some point he's going to get replaced. He's going to be moving on from the team, whatever the case is. I don't want to be left holding him. If I was, waiting for that lottery ticket as a rebuilding team, I want to cash in as quickly as I can. If I had him anywhere, I'd be asking for about a 24 first, a couple of second round picks. I don't think you can be too greedy, but I think the value you should be trying to equate to is a 24 first. But that's it for my first point, Zach. I want to kick it to you now. You've been quiet so far. You've been chilling. You've been patient. You've been waiting your turn. I'd love to hear your additional thoughts on that, or feel free to dive into your next pick, kind of the almost inverse of this in a way, kind of, maybe in a way. But go ahead, Zach. I want to hear from you. I want to hear your delightful voice.
Well, first, just a point on what you said real quick. I love
Sure.
that point, especially in a rebuild, right? And we'll talk about in another video not being afraid of older players. But in a rebuild, there's no purpose for this, right? But the
Mm-hmm.
real important thing here is you don't have to do this move now. You don't have to trade this player away now,
Yeah.
but you don't want to wait too long in the season to make that move. You do want to hold for the best value, but like for Alexander Madison, I'm waiting until the first good week that he has. Doesn't have to be amazing. 16 carries for 85 yards and a touchdown, 2 catches, 25 yards. I'm trying to sell on that right away, and it's got to be within the first 2 or 3 weeks because, as you're going to talk about later, we want to get some points off this team. So I think it's a great point. It's also something you got to be a little patient with, but you don't want to wait too long. My point here is going to be, like you said, kind of the inverse of that. And we're going to use the word identify a lot.
A lot, a
Yeah.
lot on this sheet.
I tried to stop writing the word identify. I'm trying to identify targets that fit a rebuild on other teams in the league that I could potentially buy low at any point between now and next year's rookie draft class. We have a long-term vision in place, Bob. But what players on other teams could you potentially buy low after 8 to 10 weeks of non-performance? Great example. 2 years ago, think Amon-Ra St. Brown. First 10 weeks, non-existent for the most part. Wide receiver like 80. Okay.
Yeah.
Identify players that you could potentially make those kinds of moves on. Maybe a competitive team. They may want to move some unproven players or younger players to help for a run to the playoffs. Be in their ears and be present in the league and be present in their inbox. We always talk about that. Know your league mates, have dialogue with them. Don't be a ghost in the league. But a really good example that I'm really very interested in acquiring in a lot of leagues, if I don't already have, is Kendre Miller. We don't know how he's going to fit in this offense right away, but I think all of us at the Dynasty Rewind like Kendre Miller. We like the future, 20 years old, the potential future running back of the New Orleans Saints. I'd be trying to buy before the season if at all possible, but there is a scenario where Alvin Kamara is not suspended and Kendre Miller is stuck in a three-headed running back attack until there's some injuries. But that's the player at any point this season I'd really like to be buying, Bob.
Yeah, no, I love this point 100%. I think anytime you can look to, make sure you're playing off values, make sure you're keeping these things in mind. What players can you add at a good value that will outlast your rebuild? The lovely thing about Kendre Miller is I don't think he's going to put a lot of points on the board this year. And that's why I think he's an awesome ad or an awesome target for a rebuilding team. And I don't think he's super expensive. Maybe another second round pick next year. Maybe you have a aging piece like a Keenan Allen or let's say Mike Evans. I think those two players, somewhat comparable in value, might need to add something to that side on the side of youth terms to get that deal done if you're trading with a competitive team, of course. But I love the mindset, love the concept of targeting these players that are these slow burns, the guys that aren't going to do a ton early, that will be burning a hole in competitive teams' rosters at some point this season. They're going to need points. These guys aren't going to be putting them up this year. I think targeting someone like that is an awesome move to make and an awesome thing to keep in mind whenever you're rebuilding in general. We talked about it already a little bit of being mindful of the points we're scoring as a rebuilding team. You know, if we're rebuilding, we want to try to make our draft pick pool as good as possible next year. So how can we do that? First, you should, if you are a rebuilding team, you should have your first round pick. There is so much value to having one pick in an early round that you can control the value of. In essence, you can control the value of that pick so much you can make it darn near 101, 102, 103. You get it. So make sure you have that pick because otherwise there's no point in bettering your draft capital for another team. Otherwise, go get that pick back. Find a way to get that pick back, whatever you have to do. If you're a rebuilding team, make sure you have your first round pick. Second, you need to be aware of how the draft order is determined and make sure you have that stuff in writing. Make it a pinned comment in the league chat, whatever you have to do. If it's max PF, max points for, how can you get points off the roster? Zach discussed it a little bit or is going to at some point where, you know, consolidate some assets, move picks together, move players together to get them off your roster. And let's do that in a way that we improve our draft capital next year or just straight up add draft capital to our draft pool next year. You know, it's never too early to start building that draft pool if you're a rebuilding team. Questions you should always be asking yourself if you're in a rebuild. How can I add draft capital to my next year's draft pool? And how can I improve the draft capital that already exists? Every single trade that you work through, think of those avenues. Think of how you can turn a third into a second. How can you turn a second into a first? How can you turn, be careful with this until it's later in the season. How can you turn a late second into an early second? Things like that. How can you improve those assets? Because even if you're not going, something that people have been on the channel for a while know my big thing is always targeting plus assets. And something to think about is like if you're improving draft capital, that's just as good as adding a pure new asset, in my opinion, at least, especially when you're talking draft capital. If you're improving a second to a first, a third to a second, that's darn near just as good as just getting a pure third on top because you're kind of just cutting out the middleman at that point, if you're asking me. But it's never too early to start looking at these things. Zach, feel free to touch on this. You have a great example of how to do these things with your next point of how to improve that draft capital. So what are your thoughts here? Otherwise, get into your next point.
You make such a good point, and I really want people, would they take away one thing from this video, Bob? It's what you said. It is identify your league's way of determining the draft order. And I have a great example of this. This is very important. Make sure that you identify it and then the commissioner pins the comment or you take a screenshot because it happened to me in one league where I had somebody else's draft pick and it was looking to be the 101 because of max PF. If it was in just standings, it would have been 103, 104. And the commissioner put the draft order in as the standings. And I had remembered 6 or 8 months ago that I asked in the league chat, or no, sorry, in a private message, what the leagues, because I was new to the league. And I said, I asked the commissioner, and he said it's reverse max PF. Perfect. I screenshotted that message and put it in the league chat, and he immediately changed the draft order, and I had 101. It's very important. It is so important to know that and to make sure that it's everybody knows it and that it's somewhere that you can reference back to 10 months from now, because you're not going to want to scroll back 10 months of messages, man. So it's a phenomenal point. It's not the bigger takeaway, but it's so important. It's so important to know how your league determines the draft order and to make sure that that information is accessible. Great point there, Bob.
Yeah. To build off that, what you just said, It's one of those ways, like we always talk about, knowing the league settings. It's just infinitely important. And if you're a rebuilding team, it's that much more important to you, because if you're rebuilding, there's a good chance maybe you weren't building conducive to league scoring to begin with. That's why you had to rebuild. That's why you had to resort things a little bit. But you can, once you have the league settings in mind and all of these things, and you're just well equipped to handle those, Max PF is just another way you can kind of use that to manipulate or exploit what's going on in the league to your advantages. And when you can do these things and put it all together as a rebuilding team, your rebuilds will go smoother and they'll go faster. And those are, you don't want to be rebuilding forever. We don't want to be a perpetual rebuild. We want to rebuild 1 to 2 years and be done. We don't want to have this long, drawn out fiasco where we end up stuck in the middle. Build conducive to league scorings. Zach, great additions, great emphasis. Mm-hmm. Talk on your next point here.
Yeah, we've talked about moving aging players off your roster. Well, it's also smart if you have players that do have value. Sometimes they may not fit the rebuild. Sometimes they probably might fit the rebuild. Yeah. Don't be afraid to move those pieces if you're getting, like Bob says, plus assets in return. And I have a great example. I got to give a shout out to my guy Coop in my Dynasty and Chill League. He was a rebuilding team, and he traded before the season last year T. Higgins for Garrett Wilson and a first-round pick.
I just real quick, I want to touch on this. This is a great example of manipulating value, because T. Higgins last year, and this was something I harped on all offseason, was that T. Higgins was overvalued. This is a prime example of taking advantage of that and hitting the nail on the head. Probably value-wise, even back then, was probably a little overpowered. But now, in hindsight, looks like an incredible deal.
Right.
But continue, Zach.
And listen, he's in the one of the top few spots to potentially win this league, and it's how you do it. Like, and that's a player that could have fit his rebuild. He could have said, "No, I will hold on to this player. This is a good player for me to." And
love that.
And he picked up a rookie wide receiver and a first-round pick. So, it's a way that you can turn one young asset into two. And it's something that we don't think about a lot of times, because, we get emotionally attached to these players, and a couple of them are okay, but sometimes you want to make sure that, hey, I've got an opportunity here to get a 2-for-1, and two, that something that I always try to do, especially in startup drafts, I think we talked about this recently, is like improve on a player's ADP.
Yep.
So Garrett Wilson last year was like a 6th or 7th round pick in startup drafts, if I'm not mistaken. I could be wrong there. He's a 2nd, 3rd round pick now, and he capitalized on that value, and he had a belief that was going to happen, and it did. So not only is it, hey, can I get rid of some of these older players, but how can I turn this? Maybe I don't like this player. Maybe I don't like T. Higgins. Maybe you do like T. Higgins, but that's going to depend on how you feel. But can I get more, 20% more, 30% more, 50% more than what I should for this player, who I do like and does fit my rebuild, but I can get 2 assets that now fit my rebuild.
So last year in August, so right before the season, Garrett Wilson was wide receiver 20 off the board, pick 81. He's currently wide receiver 5 off the board, pick 20. So, I mean, incredible increase in value. And T. Higgins is going around the same spot as he was last year, as he is this year. So just the dramatic shift in values, definitely breaking that way. But the amazing point is, not every, I wrote this down, so forgive me for looking over here to read it, but not every rebuilding asset needs to stay on your roster. Just because it's a good rebuilding asset, just because it's good for a rebuild, this is a prime example of taking advantage of the value that's given and running with it. Sometimes the rebuilding asset is great. I don't have a lot of qualms with T. Higgins. Never did, for what it's worth, to everybody who came after me last year when I said T. Higgins was overvalued. But fact of the matter is, there are going to be times when players who are good rebuilding assets are overvalued, and you can get more than you should in return for them. In which case, those are times where you should just pivot, or if it's those opportunities are afforded to you, where, hey, pivoting off these players is okay. There's nothing wrong with it. Love this all around. Great example and great point in general. A lot of fun points to be had there. So, My last point for rebuilding, and we've had discussions, there'll be some videos on this in the future, but being mindful of camp noise. And that means be in with those beat writers. And that doesn't mean like, oh my God, Romeo Dobbs is getting all of the attention in Packers camp. Go buy him for a second round pick right now. Doesn't mean things like that. It means when there's players that are in tough situations where there's a camp battle going on, be mindful there's going to be some players out there that you can grab off waivers, and or that you can, if you haven't had your rookie draft yet, or you haven't had a startup draft yet. I know there's a lot of those coming before we get to the season. There'll be hundreds before we get to the season between the whole community, I'm sure. But just be mindful of guys that you can get later in late rounds of your rookie drafts, late rounds of your startup drafts that are just upside swings. And then when this camp hype gets out there, whether it was a waiver ad, whether it was a late round rookie pick, late round startup pick, when this noise gets out there, this hype gets out there, whether you love the player or not, be open to moving that player. Be open to using that to improve draft capital next year. Be open to using them to add draft capital next year. When you get a player on your team, my ultimate goal is when I'm moving them off of my team, that I'm getting more in return for them, or an improved asset in return for them, than what I paid for them. That, especially with these late round drafted guys, I just want to profit. I'm not looking for production, really. If I get it on top of that, great. I'm over the moon. My ultimate goal, just get the improved asset. End of the day, that's what I want to do. So be mindful of rookie camp noise and just see who can get off waivers. You know, there's going to be plenty of these guys who are kicking around waivers right now that, you know, didn't get drafted in rookie drafts. Plenty of 3-round drafts out there, plenty of shallow rosters where you can be talking rookies, you can be talking some vets that are making noise. You never know. There's going to be plenty of assets out there. Zach, do you have anything else to add on this point, or any point in general helping out rebuilding teams as we get closer and closer to the season?
Yeah, you know, just to kind of support what you just said there, I think a great example of that is Isaiah Pacheco.
Sure.
Right?
Yeah.
I mean, I don't really remember if we like I was with Dynasty Rewind for rookie drafts last year. I don't remember us talking about Isaiah Pacheco at all.
He was one of those deep dives on the Patreon. Mike liked him a lot from the start.
Okay, so might have been a deep dive on the Patreon. I'm thinking about the pre-draft process. Definitely not somebody that we were mocking in our mock draft. So
not much.
Probably a guy in a couple of leagues that you could have gotten off the waiver wire, and you don't do that if you're not mindful of what's happening in OTAs and just taking a flyer. And I think a great guy right now, as of this recording, is Deneric Prince. Same situation, right? Basically, 7th round pick, undrafted player, same backfield, same situation. Probably going to need a running back at some point in the season. So why the heck not?
100%. I think anytime you have I think you probably get more lucky with it with running backs than you would a wide receiver. I think wide receivers are just a little harder to hit on. Usually when those guys aren't drafted, I don't think you're usually missing out on much. But you do see these running backs that are late round drafted that are in these ambiguous backfields, like Pacheco last year. Great example. I mean, we all expected Clyde for so long. No, well, I didn't. We didn't. Clyde was expected to be a breakout for so long. Just never happened, but it was a pretty ambiguous backfield. And I think after a while, the first round draft capital just has to shine off players. It has to go away. You can't hold that candle forever. I think that's early career stuff. And I think with Clyde, we'd seen enough to be like, okay, we can't, he was a first round pick, sure, but like he's not lived up to that in any capacity. So 100% keep an eye on those ambiguous backfield battles and players like that have a shot. You know, there's going to be a ton of movement between now and, you know, the regular season. Injuries are going to happen. Players might not end up signing their franchise tags, whatever the case may be. So it's just something to be mindful of. Keep an eye on those rookie camps or just training camps in general. Keep an eye on injuries, all those things, and just see what value you can create based off of paying attention to the waiver wire, paying attention to late rookie drafts, startup drafts, whatever the case may be. But Zach, I think that's going to be it for us today, unless you have anything else to add. And if you don't, that is going to be it for us today. So we will see you in the next one. I do hope you all enjoyed. Please leave a like if you did. Comment down below what you're doing as a rebuilding team in your leagues right now. leading up to the season. That's going to be it from me and Zach, though we will see you in the next one. Until then, y'all have a good one.